guys, we're going to cover everything you need to know to be strong. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're not familiar with the content that we put out already, my name is John, I'm the owner of Strength Forge, and my goal is to deliver strength to those who need it. To get everyone to understand ultimately how strength ties into everyday life and the underlying principles and applications that will allow you to excel on your journey to strong. Today we're going to be covering the number one topic that precedes anything that you will learn when it comes to physical fitness or strength, and ultimately that's to be able to create a definition of what strength actually is and how it ties into other fitness components. Today we're going to answer the simple question, what is strength? Now when people are actually asked this question, they typically respond with how we measure it. So they will say something like, it's how much weight you can lift, or what weight is on the bar, or something like that. And although they're correct in one way, that's actually a way in which we measure strength. Now to create clarity, we have to obviously understand definition. Strength, simply put, is the ability to produce tension, and we express it through force within any form of dynamic movement. And this typically, like I said, manifests itself in everyday life. We measure strength in a variety of different ways. Now this can be the weight that's on the bar, it can be how much force you apply through the ground or into another person in sports performance. It doesn't really matter. Going back to the roots definition, it's how we produce tension and how we exert force. Ultimately, from this point on, everything seems to get a little bit more complicated and people often struggle to pinpoint what type of strength they're performing. Just going off that, most people don't even know that strength is actually a multifaceted component. So what I'm going to do for you guys today is simplify everything down, make it a little bit more digestible so you understand which different types of strength there are and the movements that you'll need to be performing it with. So, with my friend Mr. Rocky, we're going to cover each of the different types of strength, each of the movements that you need to do, and keep it as simple as possible. Keeping that in mind, there are a few different variations of strength along a spectrum, and they all tie into other fitness components. Now, something to bear in mind with each of these forms of strength, they're not mutually exclusive. So they typically exist or coexist with one another in each exercise that you will perform. They simply just occur in differing amounts depending on the specific movement that you're going to be performing within the gym. Starting off, and in no particular order, we have speed strength. This is where we exert force with a higher velocity than we would typically do on standard powerlifting based movements. Classic speed strength examples would be something like a clean and jerk or a snatch that we see within Olympic weightlifting. We also then have strength endurance. Now this is what people typically do within the bodybuilding world. This is where we exert force over a sustained period of time. Another classic example of strength endurance would be carrying events within strongman. So any form of loaded carries and any form of sustained effort that involves a high amount of force. We then have explosive strength. Similar to speed strength, but with a continual acceleration component. This is typically manifested in movements such as throwing a punch, or again, like I said, going in for a tackle within a sports performance scenario. Now, a couple of the other forms of strength that people aren't necessarily familiar with, you have something like skill strength. Now this is where we exert a high amount of force but in a highly coordinated movement. Again, this is something that's common within the world of Olympic weightlifting, but it typically involves a high coordination component. So something, for example, like a snatch would have a higher skill strength demand than something like a deadlift. We then have flexibility strength. So this is the ability to exert force within a longer range of motion, where we would be going into a stretched scenario as most people would define it. This type of strength is expressed quite commonly in the world of yoga, in which you perform certain poses that take joints to the end range of motion and have to hold them in a stable position. Another form of strength is stability or resistive strength. This is the ability to absorb force rather than actually just produce it. And then finally we have everyone's favourite, which is maximal strength. Maximal strength is the one area that underpins everything else because its primary focus is obviously the ability to produce force. So there you have it, all the different types of strength that you need to be aware of and how you train each of them distinctively. Next we're going to move on to the 9 key movements that will ultimately form the framework for every single strength training program you will ever need to perform. So starting out, we have the bread and butter of lower body strength exercises, the squat. This is where we move our hips or our centre of mass up and down, closer to the ground and back up again, going through triple flexion of the ankle, knee and hip. Simply put, you take your bum down to the ground. We want to keep a neutral spine, keep your ankle, knee and hip in line with one another, and ideally keep your centre of mass over the base of support. When we're in the gym, this will typically be a barbell that's on your back. Next we have the hip hinge. This is the bread and butter of full body strength. It involves moving the hip joint backwards and forwards a little bit more than a squat typically would. We utilise the posterior chain as well as pretty much every other muscle in the body to be able to produce force. Typical examples of this within a gym setting would be something like a deadlift, a Romanian deadlift, or a kettlebell swing. We then have unilateral exercises. It's the number one form of training that most people miss, and for no apparent reason other than the fact that it's pretty difficult. There's a high stability demand, and we have a couple of different distinctive characteristics in unilateral exercises that you simply don't get within other movements. Examples of this would be a pistol squat, a lunge, or a step up. We then have loaded carries. Now, I can tell you right off the bat, if there is one form of training that most people don't do, yet most people should do, it is a form of loaded carry. It stiffens your posture and improves it. It makes your entire body strong as hell, and it also trains muscles in a sequence of locomotion that we typically, again, don't see in other sagittal plane movements. When you walk with very heavy weight, you become much more diverse and a lot stronger all round than someone who can typically only pick something heavy up off the floor. And then lastly, for the lower body exercises, we have the form of triple extension. Now this is again shown typically within the world of Olympic weightlifting, but also any form of jump or overhead throw. This will train the posterior chain and the body to coordinate rapid and explosive movement. And we would use this to train something like speed strength or explosive strength. And then moving on to the upper body exercises, we have vertical pulling, which is typically shown within the gym as a form of pull-up, lat pull down, and so on. We then have vertical pushing, so taking a weight from either the rack or from the floor to an overhead locked out position. We then have horizontal pushing, everyone's favorite, bench day, or dumbbell presses or press ups, anything that involves pressing away from your body in a horizontal plane. And then finally we have horizontal pulls, so the ability to row weights towards your body, pull yourself up in a horizontal manner. So if you're with me so far, you should be aware of the 7 different types of strength, and you're now aware of the 9 key movements that are involved within any strength training program. And then lastly, we have to address the 4 laws of training. Number 1 is consistency. You don't improve what you don't train. It's that simple. You want to be looking at a consistent form of training and a training program that not only addresses what it is that you want, but ultimately one that you're going to stick to. It's the same with anything in life. If it's a routine or a work habit that you have, you know you're not going to sustain, it's not going to be as ideal. If it's a diet that you know you're not going to stick to, it's not going to yield the results that you want. And strength training is no different. So consistency comes in there right as the first law of any training program you will ever perform. Training law number 2, specificity. That's everything we've covered so far. So if you want to get strong, you have to lift heavy. If you want to improve your speed strength, you have to move quickly. If you want to improve your resistive strength, you have to learn how to absorb load. The training that you do has to target the thing that you want to improve upon. It's that simple. Training law number 3 is individuality. You've heard the phrase before that what works for some doesn't work for others, and again, strength training is the epitome of that. We know that we need the 9 key movements within everyone's training program. That's how the human body moves, it's how it wants to be loaded, and it's how it will ultimately respond. But as you as an individual, how you're built, what your current abilities are, what your genetics are, and everything in between ultimately will decide what variation of those movements you do. I might do a back squat, you might do a front squat. I might do a sumo deadlift, you might do a conventional deadlift. Doesn't really matter, so long as we cover those 9 key movements, you can pick which variation suits you and will ultimately yield the greatest training effect. And then finally, law number 4 is progression. For you to gain something that you don't have, you have to do something that you haven't done. So over time, if you want to improve, your training has to become sequentially harder. There's loads of different models of how we can ultimately introduce progression, and again, we don't need to get that complicated within this video. Just be aware that you have to consistently perform the specific training that's best suited to you as an individual, and that progresses over time. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and took away the lesson that you need, everything that you need to know on the principle level of what it takes to be strong. I'd be really interested to know your comments below. Was there anything in this video that you weren't already aware of, different types of strength that you didn't necessarily know even existed, and any of the different movements that you currently don't perform within your training program? Where is it that you're going to start? Are you going to jump straight in at the maximal strength end, or would you ultimately like to hear my opinion on where it is you should begin? If you're already a strength athlete, are you covering all the basis of the different types of strength, or are you focusing on one area because it's something you simply enjoy? Again, I'd love to know your comments, so just leave them below this video. As always guys, it would be a huge help to me if you could click the like button and the subscribe so you can stay tuned for any future content we release. As always, stay strong and I'll see you on the next one.